Assalamu ala rasulihi wa sahbihi wa ala. My dear respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you're all doing well and in good health, and inshallah you've all survived the winds. It's been quite windy and I'm quite snugly wrapped up here. Inshallah we are continuing with our lectures on the history of the Islamic era, and today we are going to go over the topic of the Mongols, which is also sometimes known as the Tatar, although there is a distinction between the Mongols and the Tatar, as we will explain insha'Allah ta'ala. The Mongols were considered one of the most fascinating empires to have ruled a vast portion of the world. In fact, some people say that they were the largest land empire. They had land at one point at their peak, which was extending from all the way from China right through to the areas of Central Europe and reaching into the Levant and areas like that. So no doubt they were very vastly occupying many territories. Now the story of the Mongols starts from their most famous leader. In fact, he is the one who established that dynasty, and he is Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan is actually the title of that person. His actual name was Temujin, and he was from a ruling elite to start off with. Without going into too much details, because there's a lot of details to talk about, but basically he was effectively ousted initially from the whole Mongolian ruling or apparatus, if you call that, and the Mongols were essentially nomadic tribes. So they were based living in these beautiful sort of tents, which were also quite easily disassembled and then moved on, and then they would move on and rebuild depending on their needs. However, as there was this strive to become more powerful and to become more influential, their actual need, if you like, the thirst to go out there, came later on. So Genghis Khan, as I say, that was the title that was given to him later. He managed to make some alliances with the Mongols, some of the Mongols' different tribes, and by doing that he managed to get some popularity, make himself into a very important leader. He came up with a very new, well, it wasn't quite a new concept, but it was indeed a concept that helped to promote his popularity, which was that he didn't just allow the people who were from the ruling elite to be in charge and to be commanders. Rather, the people who became commanders in his format were people who proved themselves. So if you were strong, if you were good in military leadership, he would raise them up. Also, he introduced something which was also there, in fact, from the Islamic time, which was that the people who went out and fought an army, the spoils, what they captured in the battle, those would be distributed amongst the army. So this encouraged more people to become loyal, to become affiliates. Obviously now fighting was not just about serving your tribe or serving your country, but there's also financial gain to be attained. And so gradually he managed to build for himself an important loyalty, strength army. Obviously the people who are at the top, also the aristocrats, they didn't really like this kind of scenario that was happening there, and they even wanted to overthrow him as a leader because of these new ideas they had. And as a result, again, there was turmoil initially, but he managed to gain his strength. He managed to overthrow those people who were trying to displace him, and that allowed him to gain strength. So now all of a sudden he's got strength, he's got the abilities, he's got rid of those people who were potentially harming him, and that's when he takes on this whole title of Genghis Khan, which means the Lord Khan, or the master, or the great Khan. And in fact the word Khan, which is today widespread, especially amongst the Indian subcontinent, but also a little bit wider than that, is actually comes from the Mongols. This whole word Khan, which was initially used as a title to mean someone who is of high position, somebody who is a leader in position, almost like Shah or like Emir. So it was reserved to them, and as we will see later on, this was like a title that was very much unique to their usage. However, with time, Khan became extended to mean anybody who owns property or land, and then more so it started to just become a title to mean like somebody who is somebody who is of a not necessarily nobility, but somebody who has some sort of position. And so you can see now it's become a surname widely spread, but the actual word comes from the Mongolians. So Genghis Khan, his first if you like impact that he wanted to do was to go and try to take over the Chinese dynasty, to attack the Chinese, to try and gain control. And I always say this when we study history, and it's a very important link that we have to understand, is that the history of the past, the default position of the past was war. The default was war. People weren't at peace with each other. If there was no peace treaty between two countries or two powers, it means that they are at war. So everything is open. It's not like nowadays we have conventions and treaties and things like that. It would be unheard of just to go and attack another country and take it over, and that's why it becomes so absurd. And today the whole world is obsessed now with Russia invading Ukraine. It's seen such a abnormality in world politics and geopolitics today. But in the past, that was the norm. It was very normal for another country just to go and attack another one and take over, and so on. So the whole world was at power struggle, one clashing with each other, as we can see. So the Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, wanted to attack China. Indeed, they did attack China, and they managed to gain some very important strategic advancements. Although, again, the battle, it wasn't just a straightforward, it was a hit and miss. But the important thing about the Mongols, as we will understand, is that they were people who were based around nomadic tradition. So they weren't people who, if you like, had much of a civilization to start off with. They didn't have these big cities with big infrastructure and things like that. And they used to learn a lot from their expeditions. So they would go, they would attack. They might actually find that they were not achieving much, especially initially the civilized establishments had sieges. So they were based around fortifications, not just walls, but fortificated castles and cities and etc. Today, if you go to many of these old cities in the UK, has anybody been to cities like Canterbury or Chichester or York? Have you been to these places? even maybe lesser extent Winchester, you'll find that still today they have these walls. You know, the walls that are the actual old city. You know, so but obviously in the past, when you go and even see the walls, which are still today, it looks like the city is quite small. And then as the city has grown, the city is actually now extended beyond the walls, but you can still see the walls that made up the initial fortification of a city, because it was easily, because there was lots of wars and battles and things like that, a city had to protect it itself in that regards. So anyway, the point being is that the Mongols managed to learn slowly about siege warfare, how to combat siege, how to overcome their enemy who had learned to take sieges, and so they learned gradually to embark on this. Now, as I say, Genghis Khan and the Mongols, although they came from this kind of, if you like, primitive, if we can say primitive background, but actually they still had certain foundations, they still had certain traditions that they upholded, and one of those traditions was the whole aspect of respecting the envoys, the messengers. They held that very prestigious to them. The Mongols are also considered of what's known as originally from Turkic ethnicity. Today we think of Turkey as, you know, you see these pictures of, you know, if you look at Turkey, you see the pictures of the modern Turk. The modern Turks are really not unlike the traditional Turkics. The traditional Turkic were the people who had, like, you know, this kind of Far Eastern tradition. And even there is a hadith, or a few ahadith that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, and surprisingly one of them he said, because they were the Turks, they were known as Atrak, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "Utruku at-Turk ma tarakukum," and even used the play on words, because Turk also means to leave. So he said, leave the Turks as long as they leave you, meaning don't just leave them alone, because they were known for their viciousness, they were known for their, if you like, their military styles and etc. And this is what Genghis Khan developed with his people, the ability. They were very known for having good horse cavalry archers, and obviously, as I said, they learned the whole aspect of military and siege warfare. But to add this, they were quite brutal. They were brutal people. They didn't accept people who challenged them. They didn't expect people who wanted to withstand and oppose them. And so therefore, in their expeditions, they always used to give, they would always give the opposing side opportunities to surrender. And if they didn't surrender and they had to defeat them, then usually it would mean a severe annihilation of that city. Most of the inhabitants will be killed, the houses would be burnt, they would destroy the whole city. And so that also fed into the whole perspective of introducing fear into the side of the enemy. You know, when you hear about a whole city that was attacked and it was destroyed and the people were all killed, when they come to the next city, that city is already trembling. You know, what should we do? You know, etc. So introducing that aspect of fear was an important part in the way that they played out the wars. Now, initially they were focused on China, as I said, and the battles, China and etc. But for one reason or another, Genghis Khan wasn't really too specifically bothered about going west. However, he did send some envoys in the form of merchants to go and deal and trade with the Muslim. I think I can access this here. No. That's not working. Okay, the Muslim state at that time Who were the khulafa? Does anybody know? The main caliphs? Which household or which dynasty? The Abbasian, yes, the Abbasids. And where was their base? Baghdad. And however, even though the Abbasids were the khulafa, their real main rule was primarily Baghdad and the area around it. So it was a very small region of Iraq, okay? A vaster region to the areas of current day Iran and Khurasan and what they call the land beyond the sea, all these Middle Asia, Central Asia countries like currently Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. These were all controlled by a state called the Khwarizmi state, okay, which again it was separate from the Abbasid countries. To the north of Iraq you had the Zinki. From Nur ad-Din Zinki you had like a Zinki state. Into the areas of Sham and Masr, as we mentioned before, was the Ayyubi state that was established by Salah ad-Din. And then you go further west into North Africa and you have Al-Muwahhidin and Al-Murabitun, and they were all extending as well into Al-Andalus and the like. So the Muslim world was very much fragmented anyway, but the Khawarizm state, they were the people who were on the borders now with the Central and Far East Asia. So the Mongols, when they sent the envoy to one of the cities in Khawarizm, the leader there, who wasn't the actual Emir, the Emir was Muhammad Shah, but this one was another governor. He captured them and he thought that they were spies, or at least he alleged that they were spies, or they could have been spies, but that was their sort of allegement. But the Mongols had come as traders. Now, instead of dealing with them with diplomacy and trying to look at the bigger picture here, the governor, for one reason or another, he ended up executing these Mongolian merchants, and that sparked fury with Genghis Khan, who said, you know, this is not how you treat our envoys. And that was, if you like, the initiation for what would turn out to be one of the bloodiest episodes in Muslim history. So as a result, Genghis Khan sent his army to go and basically avenge the killing of these few, there were less than 10 envoys who were sent to Khawarizm. So they ended up clashing with the Muslims in Khawarizm. The Muslim leader Muhammad Shah, he ended up retreating. He would retreat from city to city, pulling away the army from cities, and those cities ended up falling one by one, and in a very bloody way as well. Like I said, the cities would be sieged if they didn't surrender, and when they the siege would fall, they would end up killing, people. And historians say that around half a million to 1 million people were killed in that area in that kind of bloody incursions. And so Genghis Khan carried on with his troops attacking and chasing the Muslims until he occupied most of the land of the state of Khawarizm. However, he didn't last long as a leader, and we know that this is the problem with any dynasties today. The problem is how to establish the passing down of power. And so Genghis had 4 sons. He had more than 4 sons, but essentially there were 4. The first one had already died before Genghis died. The second one, who was called Chaktai, he had already rejected, and this is a bit strange because he rejected his brother, the eldest brother, who wasn't died yet, but he said, I will never accept you as a leader. So he almost alienated himself, and so that ended up with the third brother, Ogbitai, to take over from his father. So he was the new leader when Genghis Khan left, and he sent his children to carry on the expeditions. Now the Mongols weren't just, as you can see, they already attacked the Chinese dynasty, and they continued to fight with the Jin dynasty in China, and they started to also extend now onto the Muslims, attacking the Muslims, and they also went further afield and clashed with the Russians, or what were known as the Rus. They clashed with the Ukrainians, they clashed with the Polish, the Bulgarians, so they were just expanding. And remember what happened? They created an atmosphere of fear where people were afraid that, from these Mongols who had a very good track record of always winning, always, these fierce warriors that they were. And not only this, obviously we said that they would be very brutal, but they also took anybody from the city who had any expertise, engineers, people who were teachers, people who were professional, even artists, things like that. They would keep them alive, and they would send them back to Mongolia or to different cities to make use of their expertise, so that they would build their civilization through the usage of others. And so through time, defeat after defeat, they expanded, and they managed to reach very vast areas, as I explained today. Unfortunately, the Google here is not working. I wanted to show you the maps, but I don't know, I can't access it from here, so I'm sorry about that. But anyway, the point being is that it was all expansions for them. It was all victories. However, at the same time, they were also having a lot of infighting. The father and the founder of the dynasty had died. The brothers amongst them were now arguing who should be in charge. There were these disputes. Each had their own little, if you like, army, etc. There was still the overall, what they call the Khakan, which is the great Khan, the ruler, the supreme ruler. But they had started to be divided. At this time, Ogbate, he sent his son Hulago, and he sent him with his continuous expeditions to come into contact with the Muslim supreme, if you like, authority, which was the Khilafah. And that was their, if you like, their aim, to overthrow Baghdad, which was the capital, which is the iconic symbol. And Baghdad at that time was the most prosperous of all cities in the world. Some people say it had more than 2 million inhabitants. Okay, at a time when London probably only had something like 20 or 30,000 people living in London. Baghdad had 2 million. It's the center of the world. This is a city. It had prosperous from all aspects. It had, in addition to having 2 rivers passing by, it was so it was a very fertile area, but also it was the attraction during the time of the Abbasid. They had gathered a lot of scholars, a lot of people. There was a science revolution there. There was an industry. Everything was happening in Baghdad, so it was a very important city which had grown. And remember, the Abbasid Khilafah had been around for now 5 centuries, so it had given a lot of time to grow, but it came with its own problems. So anyway, his now aim was to attack the Abbasids, and unfortunately the Muslims were in disarray. The Muslims were not united. The Abbasids themselves had issues with other Muslim dynasties around them. The Khalifa at the time, called Al-Musta'sim, he had his advisor was someone called Ibn al-Alqami, who was actually he was a Shi'i. He was from a Shia background. Even though Musta'sim was Sunni, he kept his advisor a Shia. And this Shi'i, he actually was a traitor. So he started to have secret negotiations with the Mongols to gradually weaken the Muslim defenses of Baghdad. A lot of the army was dismissed. So they didn't, a lot of the soldiers were dismissed. Not much money was spent on the army and on defenses. And so gradually the whole scenario was ready for the attack against Baghdad. The Mongolians, who had now subdued a lot of the area, managed to also get alliances with some Muslim dynasties to attack Baghdad. They had also taken help from some of the Crusades as well. So it was a joint effort, but obviously led by the Mongols, who now had mounted almost like a vast army of more than 100,000 people, and some even say much more than this, to attack Baghdad, forcing, after catapults and attacks on the city, they forced the Khalifa to surrender. But one of the things that the Mongols were also unfortunately known for, or infamously known for, was that they did not keep their promises. And so here they again promised the Khalifa that, look, if you surrender, if you come out, we will spare the city, we'll spare your people, etc. We will. So I mean, the Khalifa had no choice really. His city was being destroyed. He didn't have army. He didn't have. So he surrendered. But they said to him, you have to come out of the city, and you have to bring your wazirs, your ministers. Bring the ulama with you, the scholars, the teachers, all the basically the elites come with you as an envoy to surrender in front of the Hulako. So in fact he did. He came, and they ended up executing all those people that came with them, and just left the Khalifa. They brought the Khalifa to his knees. They took him back into Baghdad. And now they. After they had subdued him and they had put an end to his rule, they actually, even the way they killed him was quite a disgraceful way, because they wrapped him up in one of his rugs, rolled him up in one of his rugs, and they let the horses trample over him. And then started the massacring. For weeks, some say even up to 40 days, people were just being killed. All the inhabitants of Baghdad. The historians differ. The most conservative estimate was 800,000 people were killed of Baghdad. And some say as much as 1 million, more than 1 million people were killed. So much so that the Hulako he had to bring his army outside of Baghdad, because he was afraid that they were gonna become ill from the stench and the amount of disease and plague from all the dying corpses that were there in Baghdad. Not only this, not only did they kill the people, not only did they destroy, but they also they burnt the famous library of Baghdad, which at that time had been Al-Ma'mun. He had established something called the House of Wisdom, Dar al-Hikmah, where he had brought all these different books, translated a lot of books from Greek, from Persian, from Chinese. So it was a wealth of knowledge. In addition to all the Islamic books and Islamic contribution, this was all burnt and was all thrown into the river, destroying centuries of knowledge and civilization. So they completely attacked, and they incurred so much fear. And it's really surprising when you read the historian's account. You will really be astonished. A woman, one of the Mongolian women, would grab, and she would have on a leash more than 10 men, and she would be just taking them, and they can't do anything. They wouldn't do anything to her. One Mongolian, he would come to raid a house just by himself, and then he will find that he hasn't brought his sword or his something, and then he will say to him, "You stay here, nobody move." And then he would go, he would bring his sword, and he'll come back and kill them, and nobody moves. They are that much scared, that how much fear was placed into them, that this, and obviously this all pours into the whole aspect of when a person is so entrenched in the dunya, so much loving the dunya, they lose that, even the respect, the self-respect to at least protect yourself. Why would you allow yourself just to be killed like this, like a lamb to the slaughter? It was really astonishing. Anyway, let's move on because time is short. So the Mongols continued, after they had taken over, and this was the first time since Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, the first Khalifa. This is the first time that the Khilafah, the Muslim Khilafah, was to have ended and paused for no more. There was no more Khalif now in the Muslim world. Hulako continued to advance into the Levant, Asham. Who was ruling Asham at the time, we said? Which dynasty, which Muslim dynasty? No, some of the Zinkis, but mainly it was the Ayyubids. And a lot of the children and the grandchildren of Salahuddin. But there was also the Crusaders as well. The Crusaders also had areas in Palestine, in Lebanon. They still had fortifications, like in Tripoli, like in Akka. They had those areas as well. But anyway, he continued to advance. And at that time, one of the brothers who was ruling at that time, Moniko, he was now the ruler back in Mongolia. He died. And so Hulako, as part of a Mongolian tradition that everybody has to go back to elect their next leader, he ended up leaving that place to go back to Mongolia. But he left one of his leaders, Qutabai, and he left him to carry on advancing. Who was in Egypt at the time? Can you remember from our last lecture? The Mamalik or the Mamluks. They were leading under the leader of Saifuddin Qutuz, and they wanted to advance and they wanted to take over Egypt. Okay? But this is when, that was what we spoke about last time, so I'm not going to repeat that. But basically the Mamalik came, they mounted a big army, and they clashed with the Mongolians in the famous battle of Anjalut, which is called Anjalut because it is claimed that this is the area where Dawood killed Jalut. David killed Goliath, and so it's called Anjalut. And they managed to defeat the Mongols. The details of the battle we mentioned last time, so I'm not going to go over that again. But that was the first, if you like, halt, a big halt to the Mongolian advance. And in fact, after that, the Mongolians didn't advance. They never reached Egypt. They never reached any further than that. And gradually, they had to start to retreat. There was now infighting in Mongolia. Monaku, who was the brother of Hulako, had inherited from his father Okotupai, now had passed away. It was about who was going to take control. The Mongolians ended up factioning themselves. They became 4 major factions, or 4 major khanats, as they call them. So there was the main one in the Far East, in the areas of Mongolia and China. Remember, they had defeated the Jin dynasty. There was one there. There was one in what was known as the Chaktai Dynasty, and that was the area that covered sort of Central Asia. The Il-Khans, which was what Hulako was part of, they were the governors in the area of Persia and Iraq and all that area. And then at the same time there was one of the cousins of Hulako, Batu and Burka. They had taken a large chunk of Russia and Ukraine and that area. And that area was known as the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde. So the Mongols had divided into factions. Initially, the idea was, okay, they were like independent, but they still were under the authority of the Supreme Khan back in Mongolia. But with time going through, they started to dispute with each other. And at the same time, some of the Mongolians, like Barka, which we mentioned, he became Muslim. So some of the Mongolians became Muslim, some of these leaders. They accepted Islam, and obviously the people around them became Muslims as well. There was a lot of effort, da'wah effort, to try and convert these people. And them becoming Muslims meant that they now became at odds with each other. So Barka Khan and Holako, they started to also clash with each other. Now the Mongolians were focused on fighting each other rather than fighting the enemies around them. And so that caused a lot of weakness within the Mongols. Now, during some of the time of the earlier leaders, they had managed to establish very good systems within Mongolia. I mean, the Mongols, even though they were initially, like we say, they were nomadic tribes, but they started to gradually build up a civilization. They established and they developed what was known as the Silk Route. This was a trade route from China taking all the way into the Middle East and right into Europe. This was an important route for trading and for passing down of exchange of information and knowledge. They also focused on developing a very advanced mail system as well. So they established this mail systems where they had like different mailing posts, and riders would ride fast between each, taking their post and taking it from each post to post. And it's a system of very quite advanced for that time and very fast as well. And that was later developed for those mailing, if you like, areas to become trading posts. So all this was advanced. They developed certain roads. They developed their important, structures. So now they had sort of learned from the people that they had occupied and taken over. They had learned a lot of the aspects of building society, building the civilization. A lot of Muslims, a lot of Christians, a lot of Jews were all being employed by them to administer the affairs of the state, and so the state did prosper for a long time. The state that was existing in the Far East under somebody called Kulubtai, one of again the sons, later son, one of the grandsons of Genghis. He actually focused on China, and after defeating the Jin dynasty, he concentrated on another dynasty which is called the Song dynasty in China, and they managed to basically subdue all China under Mongolian authority, and that was the first time that the Chinese were ever ruled by somebody who wasn't Chinese in this regards. But again, as I mentioned before, later what happened, a lot of infighting, a lot of betrayals, a lot of clashing, no unity, led to them becoming factionalized. Gradually the Chinese also managed to overcome the rules of the Mongols and kick them out, throw them out. The Mongols in the other Western, a lot of them with the praise of Allah, alhamdulillah, they turned to Islam, they accepted Islam. They were still, they still had their brutal ways, if you like, but they became Muslims, they accepted Islam, and that also influenced a lot of how they dealt with things. I mean, this guy Barka, like we mentioned before, he actually made alliances with the Mamluks to fight Holako. So it became a lot of the geopolitics changed. As the central rule weakened, this gave rise to a lot of local uprisings. So now, even though you had 4 factions within Mongolia, each one of those factions was also subject to local uprisings, people who are revolting against the rules of the Mongolians. The Christians in Europe, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, they also gradually fought against the rules of the Mongols and gradually pushed them out. So with time, the Mongolians' rule gradually shrunk, and they no longer had that massive outreach that they had before. Their massive state was not only factionalized, but was quickly shrinking, and all that remained was small pockets that were existing in different parts of Central Asia, even in Russia. Some of them, carried on existing, but the height of the Mongolians came to an end in the sort of 14th, end of the 14th century. So they had, if you like, a dynasty which ruled effectively. Its heyday was about 1 century maximum. It started in the year 1206, and it reached its peak. I mean, the sacking of Baghdad was in 1258, and then gradually it started to go decline after that, having a small peak in the 13th century when they united, but again going down after that. So the Mongols, whilst they achieved such a great feat, because they didn't have any fixed civilization. I mentioned that some of the Mongols became Muslims, some of them actually became Christians, some of them became Buddhists. So they had different religions, which they didn't have a specific, if you like, civilization, a specific culture. Their initial religion was something called Shamanism, which is about people connecting with spiritual world and things like that, believing that there's a spiritual entities, and a person can, like through an elevated stance, almost like a trance, he can leave this world and then communicate with the spiritual and things like that. So they had like this, these are kind of ideas that they had before, but as you can see, it wasn't really it wasn't much meat to it. So that's why it was quickly influenced by the religions that they had colonized and taken over. Till today, there are remnants of Mongols. I mean, when you go to different countries today in the Central Asia and things, you will still see that there are Muslims there who are from Mongolian remnants, if you like, and even some of these when there was the Soviet Union and all those countries that were controlled, there are still people there within, even though they are minorities, but they're still there. They still carry the very traditional kind of Islam that they have there. So that's the story of the Mongols. As you can see, they came out from effectively nothing. They managed to reach extensive power through being organized, through unity, but also through using brute force. They managed to scare people into submission. They were very brutal. As you can see, they didn't have ethics. You can imagine Muslims would not have done anything like this. Islam, the Muslim armies, never would they have just killed people like this, innocent people, annihilated, massacred people. This goes against basic Islamic culture and basic Islamic teachings and traditions. In fact, we know that even Muslim armies sometimes would leave cities and would leave villages that they had conquered, because the people would complain that you didn't give us a warning, you didn't warn us that you were going to attack us, so they would leave. That they had the ethics of engagement is important there. The Mongols didn't have that. They were ready to kill, massacre, pillage, raze cities to the ground, and that was the kind of way that they managed to conquer. But as like anything, and as we have seen as well with the Muslim dynasties, that when there is disunity, when brothers fight each other, when father fights his son and so on, that's when you're going to have, that's when you're going to go back. That's when you're going to have the decline. That's when you're going to lose. So indeed, important dynasty to learn from. Lots of lessons to be learned there. I've summarized for you as quickly as possible within 1 hour history of two centuries with very much details involved. But they were the people who brought Khilafah to its knees, only to be reinstated inshallah later on, as we will talk about, but it was very important. But in essence, the Khilafah was already weak. As you can see, the Muslims were fragmented. They hadn't focused on important messages, important teachings, important strategic, important politics. And so when you don't plan, when you don't invest in your people, and you don't invest in your culture and your civilization and your structure, then you are asking for trouble. Jazakumullah khair. I hope that's been useful. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes. Did they manage to invade Turkey? So Turkey at that time, there was no Turkey, yeah, and there was no country called Turkey, but there was the Crusaders who were in that area, and there was some Seljuks. So they were there, and they were defeated by the Mongols. The Mongols, because they don't have a lot of number, as you can see, they're expanding very quickly. So what the Mongols used to do, they would conquer cities, and then they would allow their own leaders to carry on leading, govern, but they call them vassals. They will become vassals for the Mongolian Empire. So they become like people who would work for the Mongolians. And in some cases, like in the case of Georgia, and in the cases of even the Seljuks and even some of the Muslims, they would continue to allow the governor to stay in rule, but they would be under the rule of the Mongols, meaning that the Mongols would, if they ask them to come and join us in a battle, they will have to come and join us. If they have to send money, they will send money. So they conquered them and they subdued them, but sometimes allowed them to carry on running their affairs. Yeah. And in one occasion, one of the reasons why they attacked the Ayyubids in Asham was this guy called An-Nasr Ayyub. He was in charge of Halab and I think Damascus as well. He actually, because this is again Muslims fighting each other, the Ayyubids were before in Egypt, but then they were, as the last Ayyubid governor died, that was when it came, the Mamalik came, the new rulers of Al-Mamalik came. So some of the remnant Ayyubs in Asham, they wanted help from the Mongolians to attack the Mamalik. You see, they wanted to, so Muslims in Sham wanted the Mongols to help them to, so this Nasr, he asked Holako, he said, I want your help to attack the Mamalik so that I can take control of it. So Hulako said, who are you to ask me to help you? You are the one that comes to my help, not I, don't help you. So he said, I will teach you a lesson. And that's when he went to attack Sham. So when they attacked people, they subdued them, they expected them to be subservient to them. Any other questions? No? Jazakumullah khair. Any sisters' questions? No? Okay, inshallah, we'll end there. So next month, inshallah, we have our next session. I think next time we'll be talking about the Ottomans, inshallah, which again is a big history, but inshallah we'll try and take the main essence of that, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. We'll end there. Subhanakallah wa hamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.